All right. So welcome to today's webinar. This is Augmented, Virtual, and Mixed Reality in Learning, a case study. And I'd like to introduce our speakers for the day. I'm Hester Tinti-Kane. I'm the Chief Customer Officer of XR InLearning. We have Phil Vahey, who is the Director of Research and Innovation at SRI International, and also Chris Turner, who's the District Data Manager for Fitchburg Public Schools. XR InLearning is the organization I represent today. We accelerate awareness and adoption of virtual, augmented, and mixed realities in education and learning. We work across K through 12, higher education, and corporate learning and development. And we really help industry on the XR side connect with educators all across the learning spectrum. This is the first in a series of webinars. We're going to be exploring the transformative technologies and how these innovative leaders, including Chris, are using these technologies effectively with learners of all ages. So we're actually going to begin with a poll, and the polling is launching right now. So we would love to hear what your professional background is. Are you with the education industry? Are you with the XR industry? Are you in K-12, higher ed, corporate learning and development? Thanks for chiming in on the poll. We'll give you just another couple minutes. And while we're doing that, I just got a note from our tech support, and she said that you should be able to turn on your video, Chris and Phil. So I think hopefully we can see your faces as it's time for you guys to talk. Okay.
Just so you know, it's still saying the same thing, but I'll keep trying.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, I'm gonna end the poll and I'm gonna share the results so that you can see the majority of our audience today is higher education, and followed by researchers, and then education industry, K-12, and XR industry. So thanks very much for responding to the poll. We'll have another poll a little bit later on in the session. Great. Okay, so we're going to move on. And Phil, I'm going to hand the mic over to you. And not sure whether we're able to see you or not.
It's still giving me the same thing, but people can look at that and pretend it's not a picture of me about 10 years ago, but that's how I look exactly today.
Very good. Okay, please
yes.
Let me know when to advance your slides, Phil.
Great, thanks. So as Hester said, I'm in SRI Education, a part of SRI International, and we worked with Hester and the XR InLearning group to create a survey of educators who currently are involved in some way in the XR area. So we can go to the next. Just for a little bit of background, so you know who SRI International is. We are an independent, not-for-profit research institute. We've been around really since 1946, but independent since 1970. With about 2,000 staff members, and we have about 200 of those members work in the area of education. And if we go next, SRI, we've been around for a long time, and we've really been responsible for a lot of the innovations people touch every day. For instance, the computer mouse, we sent the first message in what became the internet. We actually created the first commercially available augmented reality technology of like what we see in the United States as the first down line in football games. And now there's a whole lot of other examples of it. I think the first use might have been an offside line in soccer games, but that's neither here nor there. The point being that SRI's, and also we created Siri, and we're still doing work in the virtual personal assistant areas. And so we're really excited about this area of augmented, virtual, and mixed reality because we see it as a convergence of a lot of the kind of technologies we've been working on for some time, and a way to really, if done correctly, have a major impact on the way our students learn about important concepts. So we can go on. This is just an example of the work that SRI Education does. We do work in assessment, in evaluation, and learning analytics, and actually creating materials ourselves. And again, from all these different perspectives, we're excited about what these new technologies have to offer. From an assessment perspective, how do we assess what children are learning when they're learning with these new modalities and potentially very new concepts? From an evaluation, how do we evaluate if the students are getting out of it what we want? The real end result might not be a bubble test at the end, but we might want to be evaluating on different types of measures. As we create curricular materials, how do we know that we're creating those that really leverage these technologies the best and take advantage of their unique affordances? So again, it's kind of reinforced the idea that we really see this as being a significant step, potentially a significant step forward in education. Okay, Hester. And as one example of how we're thinking about this, we've been working in our education group with others doing research for adults and occasionally the military and others. For instance, how do we help adults maintain vehicles that are large, complex, expensive, and are rarely maintained? So this is an example of using an augmented reality system mixed with what we call a virtual personal assistant. Think a specialized Siri integrated with your augmented reality, where you can have a genuine discussion with your technology, state what you want to do. It can actually look up in manuals or in other databases what the right thing to do is and how to do it. And so in this particular example, it could tell you exactly how to remove the proper screws in the proper place with the right tool, where to place the tool, how many turns, for instance. And while this is really very procedural and helping people do things that are very much known procedures, we're working now to understand how can these systems work not to guide people through procedures, but to guide students through learning, and learning of typically difficult to learn and important concepts. Okay, so now on to the actual survey. So in all this, right, we're being very forward thinking and what can happen in, 5-10 years with this technology. But working with Hester's group, the question is, for those educators who are currently using or want to use XR technologies, what are they doing and what are they thinking about? And this is really important, we think, to get a bit of ground truth on where are we now and what are the next best steps that we can take to really help existing educators. So we worked with two companies in the XR in education area, Labster and Lifelike. And through their communities, we heard from 115 educators. They're a pretty even split between higher ed and K-12. 108 of them had personal experience with XR technologies, and 56 of them had actually used these technologies in their classroom. So as we talk about the survey, you'll see sometimes we're talking about all 115, sometimes we're talking about 108, and sometimes we're talking about the number of 56, depending on the question. And in this, we heard from people from 37 countries, 42% from the US, so the majority were from non-US. Really interesting is 92% had more than 3 years experience and 23% had more than 20 years of experience. So that right there was really interesting and surprising to us when saying, what's the ground truth? We often expect, oh, it's the new people coming in. They're the ones that really want to adopt this. We're finding, not only experienced teachers 3 years, but often experienced teachers with much more experience are the ones that are also adopting this. So we shouldn't leave them behind. In terms of what they teach, we'll notice here that our numbers add up to well more than 100, especially in the K-12. And that's because K-12 teachers tend to teach more than one topic. But the teaching that we got covered a broad range. So we see that the majority for both K-12 and post-secondary teach science. And then from there, the STEM, we got science, technology, engineering, math. Those tend to account for a large proportion overall, right? So kind of as expected, it's the teachers in STEM that tend to be most interested in this technology. But that doesn't mean that other teachers aren't interested. We see that language arts and humanities both had a significant amount, in fact, more than engineering, right? In the K-12, for example. So there is really a broad interest in using these technologies in education, both in K-12 and post-secondary. Now, when we talk to educators, it's important as a community, we meet them where they are. And, you know, as expected, right, the overwhelming majority have heard of virtual reality. 93% have heard of virtual reality. 83% have heard of augmented reality, and only 71% heard of mixed reality. And again, this is not the general teaching population. These are people already invested in these technologies. So while we understand, and actually I like the term mixed reality a lot more, I think it's much more indicative of kind of where the future is and where great learning can happen. We have to be a bit careful when communicating with our educators to make sure we're speaking in terms that they understand. And here we didn't split out K-12 and higher ed because there wasn't a big difference between them. In terms of their own personal experience, similarly, right, 89 to almost 90% have experienced virtual reality, right? 67% at the time said they experienced augmented reality, and under half said they had experienced mixed reality. And so again, in terms of meeting teachers where they are, it's important that we understand this. And something that I'm going to put a little pin in for future years is this augmented reality number was surprisingly low to us, given that right now you can have augmented reality on your Android, on your iPhone, on your tablets. It could be at the time that this survey was done almost exactly 1 year ago. It hadn't quite broken through. So I think as we go through and see more years, augmented reality will start to raise up as it's really much more available to people from the, not from the headset perspective necessarily, but from the devices they're already using. And in terms of classroom use, the numbers are actually surprisingly closer than in what they've used and what they've heard of, right? 60% of those who have used these technologies in the classroom have used virtual reality. 47% have used augmented reality, and 35% have used mixed reality in the K-12. And I'm going to focus on K-12. Thank you for doing the poll, Hester, because that's where our people were, right? There were very few higher ed. Is that right? Or did I misremember the poll? Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that, Phil. There were more higher ed than K-12.
Okay, so opposite then. Okay, so sorry about that, folks. So 38. So and in the higher ed, 38% have used virtual reality, 21% augmented, and 15% mixed reality, right? And so it still has that same general skew right now, that virtual reality more than augmented and mixed. And again, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future as augmented reality shows up on your phones as well, beyond headsets. We also asked the general audience, what are the best uses of XR in classrooms? And so Hester, if you could hit forward once, 49% of the responses we got were just general descriptions of use, right? So to explore ideas, subjects, or course materials in ways that couldn't be done otherwise, or demonstrate a real-world phenomena, or illustrate abstract concepts, or arouse interest and motivation. So an interesting thing about those, they weren't really content specific like the science was, right? So about a third of the responses we got were very specific to science. So for instance, look at the body while seeing the circulatory system to learn where blood flows, or allow students to perform dangerous experiments virtually, right? So in these, we had people looking very specifically at what the uses that we would have for science. Although far fewer for social science, we got some really interesting responses there. Right, like one group said, we're working with museums to scan their holdings, produce 3D models, and share them online so that students and teachers around the world can use these primary sources. So that's an exciting way of using these kind of virtual reality technologies to provide students access to objects. They could be artistic, they could be more from anthropology, but objects that you really wouldn't have the chance to see otherwise, right, and to experience more fully than on a flat desktop. So one thing we asked, though, those are great uses and what people would like to use. For those of you who aren't using them in the classroom, what prevents your use, right? And we think this general spread is pretty interesting. We see that many of them don't have the hardware or the software, right, or the training to use them, right? And so these are people who aren't able to use them, and they identify these. They don't have access to hardware, they don't have access to software, they don't have access to training. Interestingly, they're not as concerned about is there appropriate curriculum or time in the school year, which we thought would be major blockers as well. So right now, the blockers seem to be much more fundamental, right? Than is there time in the school year, is the curriculum. It's how can they actually get to the actual resources, and then once they have them, how can they get trained on them? Right. So then we asked, well, of those teachers who are using XR in the classroom, what kind of training do you get? And we found out pretty much they're not getting training, right? 25% said they're getting some kind of informal training, you know, YouTube videos, that kind of thing. And 7% they get formal training, what you'd consider professional development classes. And interestingly, every person in that 7% also clicked the informal box. So the 25% is total of get training. It's not 25 plus 7. And I think this is a really important finding for folks out there. If you're developing for teachers or working with teachers or want to get materials in the hands of teachers, we saw that those who aren't using it put training up as one of their top 3 concerns. And even those who are using it aren't getting access to training. And so I would just put that up as a red flag for us. If we really want to see these technologies adopted, we're going to have to get more training for our teachers. Now, for those teachers who are using them, and again, these are early adopter teachers, so they're going to go above and beyond what your average teacher might do, right? We really see, while some of these bars look big, the highest is 18%, and that's just miscellaneous other. The next highest is 16%, right? So they're really not, those who are using them seem pretty satisfied with being able to address the challenges. They don't list cost as a challenge. They've clearly overcome that challenge. They think that student and teacher familiarity is the most important challenge right now, which I could see. If students aren't used to using it, you can't spend half your class period introducing students to the technology and getting the headsets on them, et cetera. You want that to be more of an everyday part of their experience. But these other ones are also all very small, around 10%. So really we see for those teachers who are using it, they're really managing to overcome some of the major challenges that other teachers have pointed out. And then we also asked them, the teachers who are using technology in the classroom, what more would you like? What are you not getting out of these use of these technologies? And half just simply stated more content, right? And again, that was a little bit of a surprise to us in that 15% of interactive interface, this was coded. They gave their own answers. And so what we meant by interactive interface is a pretty broad category, but it was for those teachers who said, I want my students to have more interaction. I want them to be able to modify the simulations. I want them to be able to have more control of the environment they're in. That was relatively small and a big surprise to us. We really expected that they would have wanted their students to engage in more interaction versus the kind of field trip experiences. It could be because those that have interaction are quite satisfied with it, or it could be because this is so novel that still the field trip is considered really high engaging and of good value by itself. So right now what our teachers are asking for really is more content. And they're also not asking to be able to design their own applications or scenarios at this point. So it's hard to say again if that's kind of temporary, and in a couple of years they're going to say, okay, I've done everything that exists out there. I need to design my own for my particular application, for my particular context. But as of right now, there's simply the request is that those who are using it want just more content. And I think that's all. So thank you all very much. I'm interested and excited to hear from Chris on his. And so you hear from Chris a very particular use of these technologies, whereas I gave the kind of broad overview of what we see is going on out in the field.
I'm just checking in to see if we have any questions. If you have any questions right now, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. I will keep my eye on this. I see that we don't have any questions at the moment, so we will go ahead and move forward. Let me share again. We'll get our slides going. Great. Okay, Chris.
Yes, thank you, Hester, so much. I'm very excited to be able to share our experience in Fitchburg, what we've been doing for about the past year and a half now. And I just want to thank Phil for that wonderful research. It certainly speaks to what we feel is going on in Fitchburg right now. And I just want to thank everyone for coming today and taking part in this. So hi everyone, my name is Chris Turner. I'm the District Data Manager for the Fitchburg Public Schools. And about a year and a half ago, late fall of 2017, our science coordinator was at our local Boys and Girls Club and saw a beautiful piece of equipment that we later learned was called an augmented reality sandbox, which is similarly constructed to what you would imagine a sandbox to look like. But the key difference is that the sand inside the sandbox is white because above the sand is a digital projector and a camera. And the two work in harmony along with a device to create a 3D interactive, completely engaging living map, basically, and it allows students to create landforms with their hands and have it be updated in real time. So I believe we should have a little video here to give you an idea of what this looks like. So as you can see, this child had made a mountain, and now with their hand, they're simply flattening it out. And as they're doing that, the camera above the sandbox is noticing the change in the structure. And as a result, it's relaying that information back to the desktop that this is currently hooked up to, which is running a very specialized piece of software. And it's changing what the digital projector is showing. And so as a result, students are able to create peaks and valleys, mountains, plateaus, islands, peninsulas, anything that you can possibly imagine. So it's been a really transformative piece of equipment. So I just wanted to kind of go through how we created ours, a few key points about that, how we move it from building to building, and just kind of tidy it all up with a summary. So originally, the sandbox that our science coordinator saw with her daughters was a very fixed piece of equipment. It was in a room at the Boys and Girls Club. You could tell it was a fixture just as much as the wall was. It wasn't meant to ever be moved. It was carefully and painstakingly crafted for that spot, calibrated to perfection, and it looked really beautiful. So she came back and we said, well, how can we bring this to Fitchburg for our schools? We are a small urban district, about an hour outside of Boston. We have 4 elementary schools across our district, and we need to be able to do this at a cost-effective rate. So basically, the box that you see in front of you, this is just a 3D rendering I had done in Google SketchUp. It's about 4 feet wide by 3 feet long and about 7 inches deep on the inside. It's filled with 200 pounds of white sand. We specifically chose white because much like you would project onto a whiteboard or a white screen, this gives the projector a brilliant surface to light up. If we want to go to the next one. So the real magic kind of happens up above the sandbox. As you can see on the back there, there's 2 parallel steel tubes, similar to what you might find to hold up like street signs or stop signs. And at the top of that is our digital short throw projector. And then an arm in front of that, kind of more center mounted over the sandbox, is a Microsoft Xbox Connect camera that has special 3D lenses. And so those kind of work in harmony along with a computer that is running specialized software to kind of work in conjunction, sort of the camera is the eyes of the whole operation. So if we want to move to the next one. So as I mentioned, we have 4 elementary schools that we wanted to be able to use this with, specifically in our 4th grade and their landform curriculum unit. So one of the main considerations when we were designing our sandbox was how can we quickly package this all up and safely transport it from building to building when it's time to move on to the next elementary school. So using those steel tubes and some lawn bolts through the back of the box, we actually hold it in place. And it's totally safe to use while the children are engaging with it, and just a matter of undoing those wing nuts and gently taking down the poles with the projector and the camera attached to it. The sand is loaded into 5-gallon buckets using little scoops that we have. We have handles on it, so basically the entire box is emptied of its sand, and you kind of carry it on its side, kind of like a big screen TV, if you will. The disassembly process really doesn't take very long, about 15 to 20 minutes total. So to move it from one building to another, we found it hasn't been a tremendous burden. And specifically, when using the Windows Magic Sand program, we can calibrate it in roughly 30 seconds. So our specific design is really meant for portability and ease of use to move it from building to building. And now just for a little kind of narrative of our story, when we initially went down this route, we found the gentleman who created the software. His name is Oliver Krelios. He's an associate professor at the University of California at Davis. He specifically wrote the program to run on Linux and requiring a fairly high-end gaming desktop. So alongside of building an AR sandbox, we also had to cobble together a very high-end graphical desktop as well. It was a little bit tricky to get the software to run, and the calibration process can be fairly tedious. Unlike the Windows version, it can take closer to 5 minutes to calibrate it, and it seems to need to be calibrated more often than the Windows version. The upside to using a Linux desktop running all of our software specifically is, as you can see in the picture above there, you have this beautiful water simulation that you're able to see. And while that is certainly, originally was certainly a very attractive piece of the component, specifically where this was for our 4th grade landform curriculum, we decided to pivot, and instead of using a high-end gaming machine, we decided to go with more of a mid-range laptop running Windows and running a ported version of Oliver's program called Magic Sand. The benefit to this is that our staff is almost abundantly familiar with Windows. They're in a much better place to be able to calibrate it and set it up themselves. So it's more of like a strategic release of this equipment. As you can see in the picture above, the Linux version of the software, as I mentioned, has that water simulation as part of it, but it also has beautiful color mapping and contour lines to demonstrate the elevation. The only drawback with using the Windows laptop is that you lose that water-like feature, but you still do maintain the contour lines and the elevation, which is absolutely critical for children. So they know that when they're digging down low and the sand is getting closer to the bottom of the box, it's blue to represent water. And as it gets higher, kind of more of a mid-level, it becomes green for land. And as it gets higher and higher, it goes to yellows and orange and reds and eventually whites. So even though we're using different hardware, it's all still fully functional. The only thing we lose is that water piece. I wanted to kind of break down just really how doable this certainly can be. I certainly don't want to put any of the AR sandbox companies out there, but when we originally looked into what it would take to get one of these ourselves, we were shocked by the amount of money that one unit would cost. They were upwards of $7,000 to $8,000. And a tremendous amount of them weren't portable, were designed to be in a makerspace or on a science lab and to never be moved and never utilized at multiple sites throughout the school year. So this is just a simple breakdown of the amount of material costs that we paid for in order to bring this to life. And obviously this doesn't include the laptop costs. Certainly any laptop that you might have available to you, it would certainly be viable for this. So basically just the lumber, a little over $80. The steel tubing is kind of expensive, but it certainly is durable enough and strong enough to hold up that projector and camera about 3 feet above the box. All of the sorts of like hardware, the nuts and bolts and screws and stuff, about $113. The digital projector, it's an ultra short throw projector because it's only mounted above 3 feet above the box and needs to fill about a 40-inch by 30-inch space. So that's a little under $600. The Xbox Connect camera was actually donated to us, but we found they tend to only be about $20. So that seems very affordable. And then the white sand, for 200 pounds of white sand, was only $160. So for a little over $1,000, not including the cost of a laptop, and a little bit of sweat equity and time, you're able to transform raw materials and blank white sand into the beautiful colored and contoured line sand that you can see on the bottom right there. So if I want to move on. So I just wanted to kind of talk about the engagement factor that this has had for our children. for a long time, our children have learned about landform curriculum through a myriad of activities, and we certainly incorporate some of those activities still when we bring the sandbox into their school. One of the reasons we're able to do this is because we've dedicated our technology staff as part of kind of a one-day event at each of our elementary schools. And basically, we have the sandbox set up as one station of 5. Our typical class size is about 25, so we have usually 5 groups of 5 students that engage in an activity, and one of them being the sandbox, for about 10 minutes. We have other wraparound activities. There's a YouTube video, there's a Google mapping exercise, they do some local mapping, and basically they cycle through this, so in about an hour, each class is able to partake in this. And so at less than a day that we're able to get through the entire 4th grade at one of our schools. And this has been really critical because it turned this tool into not a standalone unit, but it's complementary to what they've already learned in their classroom and what they're learning alongside with the other 4 activities. And so we really like this model of engagement plus comprehension really does equal retention. Certainly the students have such a stronger grasp of being able to understand the differences between an island and a peninsula and an isthmus and a plain and a plateau. And they're able to understand how when the color changes and the contour lines are closer together or further apart, what that actually means in real time. And so it truly has been a transformative piece of equipment for us. I would certainly recommend if anyone were interested. I had developed this website, ar.fitchburg.k12.ma.us, that you see displayed on your screen right now. There's a whole bunch of information we've tried to put up there. All the links to the original pages, like Oliver Crelios's page or the Magic Sand page, can all be found there. A 3D rendering that's pretty close to the accurate dimensions of the sandbox can be found on there from Google SketchUp. Originally we made this for our staff to be able to kind of learn about it and kind of introduce it to their students before we came in and did the activity with them. But we've since opened it up more to a public website just so that anyone interested out there could use this as a material, as a resource, if they were ever interested in building their own sandbox. So I know I kind of went through it quickly. I certainly want to leave time for any questions or comments or just anything that anyone had to add. But I certainly thank everyone for their time, and I hope that they were able to get a lot out of it.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Phil, and thank you so much, Chris. We do have some questions in the chat here. So let's see here. There's a question from Billy asking, is content creation in XR something that the researchers feel is something teachers will want as soon as Google Docs? Google Docs is releasing a version of XR creation, apparently. This is something that I wasn't aware of. Given that teachers often create their own non-XR learning modules. So here's the question, what about content creation in XR? Chris, Phil, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, so I can start off, and of course we're kind of guessing here, right? Where we're projecting out into the future, right? And that's what I thought. Google Docs just a reference, not being released. So right now, some teachers I've seen are using some frameworks for content creation, for instance, to make XR tours of their towns, right? And so that students can walk around and put milestone points up at key parts, and so people could walk around their towns and really get a sense of the history, for instance. So when I'm on the East Coast, an American Revolution unit could have what were key parts of the American Revolution that happened in their own localities. So from that perspective, there really is a benefit, and there might be a drive to kind of make these localized versions. And that would tend to, I think, be, use a particular toolkit kind of optimized for that. So in that sense, they'd use a toolkit to create custom materials. I'd say in terms of other aspects, if you want your student to take a tour of the Louvre or learn about electromagnetism or kind of see a simulation of speed of a slope through an augmented reality runner, right? I could see teachers wanting some amount of customization. For instance, putting either objects in the Louvre or electromagnetism units or topics in orders that they want. And maybe having a little bit of customization around the edges, right? Like if there's a character running across the screen, can you choose what character it is or what the shape of it is, right? Or can you choose specific graph lines? I think at this point, for the upcoming future, it will probably be hard beyond what teachers are going to want to do, to give them full authoring control, like put them in a Unity environment, right? That might happen, but I think it'll take a while before that. I think right now it will be much more likely that they're given ways to customize for their own particular needs, but they're choosing from existing resources. And that's how a lot of teachers do customize their current curriculum anyway. They tend to not write the math textbook, right? They tend to like this chapter from that book and this chapter from this supplemental materials and this they found from another teacher someplace. And maybe they've created some percent of what they're doing with their students, but a lot of it tends to be sort of created more in a bricolage fashion to kind of bring together different materials that they've that they've managed to find and that they put together in a way they want. And I would say that would be more likely for the XR materials.
Thank you, Phil. And I did also notice in the research, the findings did not point to the fact that people were looking for a lot of content creation. It actually showed that they were looking for already created off-the-shelf type of content. But I do want to turn to Chris because early on, if people logged in early, they heard Chris and I talking about some of the work that sixth graders in his district have done creating XR content. So Chris, over to you to respond to this question from Billy.
Absolutely. So yeah, just to briefly recap what Hester and I were talking about, we had the opportunity yesterday to go to the Boston, to our state house, and our sixth grade advanced academics coach was able to bring 4 children who created their own Google expedition using, we have several 360-degree cameras that we're able to loan out to various folks. And so they actually went to the local art museum in Fitchburg, which has this fabulous ancient Egypt exhibit. And of course, Google Expeditions, there's about 1,000 different virtual reality tours that classes are able to go on field trips all over the world, all over the universe, basically. And yet, I mean, they're not going to come to Fitchburg for the art museum. And so these children who had been there before said, well, why don't we go and make our own Google expedition? So certainly from like a teacher perspective, I think being able to kind of give that freedom and give that power to students to create their own content. I mean, they certainly had a felt need to do that. And so they went and they actually took, I think, 7 or 8 different photos that ended up in the Google expedition, and the whole thing's has a narrated piece, and they have different points where they can call it out. So yesterday they were invited to the State House and had 5 of the VR phones from their kit and put them in the headsets. And I've just never seen 11 and 12-year-olds so excited to talk to complete and utter strangers about their local art museum and its ancient Egypt exhibit. So I certainly think from like a teacher perspective, there definitely, there could be that teacher out there that wants to be able to create their own XR content. I think with this instance, I've seen it more myself. Students want to create their own XR content. And I think that just speaks just back to the AR sandbox, that is such an engaging and empowering way for them to be, compelled to do something like that. And that when you get that engagement and that comprehension, that they really are going to have such an increased retention for that. And I mean, just to see their faces, to be able to, can I talk to you about, going up to total strangers, and wanting to be able to show what they've created. And I mean, it was just fabulous. We're still talking about it. They were so great.
So thanks for that, Chris. And like circling back around the Google content creation opportunity, it really is Google Tour Creator, right, Chris?
Yes. Yep. So I believe they've made their own using Tour Creator from images. Like I know they made their own of the White Mountains in New Hampshire, but those weren't photos of that they had personally taken. That was just part of Google Street View. But yes, the ones at the Fitchburg Art Museum were their own, that they imported the 360 photo, and then compiled those and made a little Google expedition of their own.
That's exciting. So back to the sandbox, there was a question from Nick about creating a smaller version of the sandbox or a virtual reality version of the sandbox. So from your experience, Chris, is there a way to, or from your imagination, is there a way to generate a smaller version of what you've done?
Absolutely. We chose those dimensions just because it seemed to be like a nice, a 4:3 aspect ratio. Just make it 40 inches by 30 inches of the interior. Seemed certainly nice. Certainly you could go smaller, and if you did, then you certainly wouldn't have to have the projector nearly as high. My advice, I would almost say, like, if you could, like, find a big enough table, and I would almost think about putting down, like, painter's tape or masking tape, and physically kind of map out what you think a good size would be, keeping in mind that aspect ratio of the projector. But certainly you could build it smaller. It just would mean that fewer students would be able to kind of gather around it. Typically with our sandbox, we have about 5 students that will gather around kind of the front and sides. We tend to keep them away from the back where, like, the metal poles are that hold up the projector, just for safety reasons. But yeah, you certainly could build it smaller. And then to answer the part about the virtual reality, if you look up Oliver Krelios, and again, his link is on our AR page, I believe he was doing some experimental VR stuff, and I'm blanking if it was the Rift or the Vive. But basically, I think the idea was that you could create a mountain physically in the AR sandbox, and then if you had a VR headset hooked up to the same computer, that you could actually see that mountain in virtual reality as well, and almost kind of walk it in a sense. But I don't know if that was a public project yet. I think I just saw it and went, wow, that's really cool. Maybe someday we'll get to that point. But yeah, I think that certainly is a possibility.
So Chris, we do have a question from Margarita, and she's asking what type of projector you used for the AR sandbox.
Sure. I would have to look up the specific model. I know it was a BenQ, and I know it specifically said ultra short throw in the title. If I have to recall the model number, I want to say it was like a 3200, perhaps. My contact email is on both this slide deck and on that AR website too. So I could certainly, if anyone wanted to reach out, I could certainly look up, like, the old purchase order that we had used for that specific model number.
That's great. Margarita also wanted to know about professional development for using AR in the classroom. So that sort of dovetails with a question that I wanted to ask Chris. How did the teachers respond to this AR sandbox? And how did you prepare them to use it as part of the 4th grade curriculum here?
Definitely. A lot of that work was done by our science coordinator. She works very closely with that cohort of 4th grade teachers at each of our schools. So basically, we have our landform curriculum, and she'll work, not only in scheduling it, because obviously we do this over, several months. Basically for elementary schools, we might do, one day, 1 month for a school, and then pack it up and bring it back, and then the next month we'll deploy it again and do it, do all the activities that day. So she works very closely with them to make sure that kind of, ramps up at the appropriate time. Their response to it across the board, I mean, we're talking 4 to 5 teachers across 4 schools. So let's say 18 teachers in 4th grade. They have absolutely been enthralled with it. Sometimes it's a little hard to pull them away and let their children actually get a chance at the sandbox, because I think they want to use it just as much as the children, because, I mean, just to be able to create mountains with your hands in 5 seconds, it's a joy for any age. But yeah, they have been, I think they've really seen the impact it's had We try with the best of intentions to try to get the sandbox out more towards the beginning of the year so that it doesn't run into our spring schedule of statewide high stakes testing. And so we try to do it kind of more so in the beginning of the year, and it's just amazing the amount of retention, like this time of year, the school year is winding down and children are still talking about it and children are still actively engaged in it. And now that we're in our second year of doing it, it's amazing how word has traveled. And someone will say, my cousin did this last year, my sibling did this last year, it's amazing. It's kind of word of mouth, there's quite a buzz amongst the 10-year-olds of Fitchburg about this AR sandbox. So I think everyone involved sees its engagement level and sees how compelling of a tool it is to use it. So it's been nothing but positive for us.
That's great to hear. So a couple of additional comments and questions have come in, and I want to make sure that we're airing these. So there is definitely some interest from Steve saying that the ability to create content in Teams could be really exciting. And there are, I know Unity for one, and some of the other platforms are working with educational institutions, excuse me, to provide access to students so that they would have the opportunity to create in XR. We have a question from Joe about the Oculus Quest and whether you see exciting potential when it comes to the Oculus Quest.
I'll be honest, I'm trying to get one myself. Yeah, we dabbled. We bought, I think, 1 or 2 Oculus Go's, and we're somewhat disappointed with them. I'm thinking it's probably, our budget year runs July to June, so I'm thinking it's probably going to be a July or August purchase for us. I've seen a little bit of it, but I would love to be able to get my hands on it and see what capabilities it actually has, because it certainly looks incredibly amazing for that price figure, and not needing a computer to hook up to looks tremendous.
So this does lead me to one of the questions that I wanted to put to both of you, and Phil, maybe you could begin. When we see these transformative technologies, what do you think they uniquely bring to the process of learning, to the process of education?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, Hester. Because we have really great potential with these technologies, but the question is, will the potential be realized in a way that they get adopted by a large number of teachers in schools to help a large number of students learn, right? And something that I'm personally, and our research group is really excited about, is the ability to have these technologies visualize important ideas that are typically either invisible or are just highly conceptual, only available in kind of highly conceptual, abstract ways. So a great example of this is what Chris just showed us, right, in terms of how we represent elevation, right? And we have the contour lines that show elevation. And we know that when those are on a flat textbook, they're really very hard for students to understand, even in those cases where we can get them relief maps with contour lines on them. It's still very difficult to understand what does it mean when their lines are spaced far apart but very close together, and exactly just what does each line mean itself, and is it the idea that it's an equal vertical height between each line is a really difficult thing, because those lines, they're not even lines, right? They're crazy shapes based on the contours you have. And letting the children play with their hands and construct the actual landforms while then seeing these typically, until now, highly abstract contour lines projected on the physical space they just created, really, I think, has the potential to allow far more students to genuinely grasp the important ideas behind these representations, and then be able to go beyond and understand more kind of what the implications of these ideas are. And that's where we really see some of the big benefits, right? Like, what does it mean? You can experience the Doppler effect in virtual reality, but what does it mean to connect that directly to some of the scientific representations, or some of the force diagrams in physics, or electromagnetic waves, right? So making these connections between what are typically highly abstract representational forms that appear often in static forms in textbooks, and making making the direct link between those and what the students are directly experiencing, I think really has the chance to change how students learn important science and math concepts. That said, we need to actually get that done, right? Like people have to make those materials. Right now, I'm a little concerned that a lot of the materials are out there because they look cool and they're engaging and they're fun. But that lasts for a short amount of time before the majority of teachers say, you know, it was fun, but it was also a lot of effort, and my kids didn't learn the content they have to learn, right? So how do we really make these materials that are not only fun, that are not only engaging, but directly address some of these high-level concepts? Our children are now having a hard time for learning, but they are responsible for learning.
And that sort of leads me to my next question. And then we've got another question coming from the chat. So in terms of measuring the impact on learning through the use of these technologies, do you have thoughts? Do you have ideas? Do you have stories to tell? Do you have plans, Chris, happening in your district, for example?
I know that Jessica, our science coordinator, has certainly discussed, and I think there is going to be some planning over the summer with some of the science folks and how to actually evaluate and have some quantifiable data off of this. So I'm certainly hopeful, to see what she comes back with. It definitely, we certainly don't have anything tangible, but I would certainly say just the fact that we have seen this kind of, if we do the sandbox at the beginning of the year and we come back at the end of the year, that the students have this retention. Same with all the VR efforts that we've been doing. I mean, I feel like those 4 students yesterday that were talking about the ancient Egypt exhibit at the, Fitchburg Museum of Arts is probably, they're probably experts on a topic that, not many 6th graders would probably, be able to speak, nearly as far as they were yesterday, and to speak so confidently of it too. So I certainly feel like not only is there a retention factor to it, but there's also that kind of empowering ability for students, and they almost feel like they're kind of, masters of their own destiny of learning in a sense. So it certainly could speak to, like, this boon of personalized learning that the education world is seeing right now.
Right. And Phil, over to you. Any thoughts on that, or with other technologies that your organization has studied in the past? What is the general approach to measure the impact of that particular technology on learning and learning outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, this is really important because there's different reasons for using it. Some of them, like, we know that when students enter high school, one of the biggest predictors of how well they do in their science and math courses is how interested they are in science and math, right? And so we are working on how do we measure engagement and interest in these topics, but that also can't come at the expense of learning the deep conceptual ideas. Because if you go into high school with interest, but you don't have some of the foundational understandings that you need, right, you're going to be in trouble as well. So I think it's really going to be an important question, Hester, and all, as we move forward. When we use these materials, we have to be really clear, maybe not today because it's still the early stages, but pretty soon we have to be pretty clear on what is our intended goal. Is it, if it's engagement, that's one thing, but is engagement that lasts? Does it actually pique their interest in being a scientist or learning more about STEM? Or is it just interest in this one particular class? If they've learned more, is it learning that lasts, right? And are they really learning the important science and math or other topics? I tend to be biased towards science and math, as you can tell, that they have to be learning, right? So I think that we're still pretty early on in this, but some of these questions have been around for a while. Right. There's also questions around mindset, right? There's a Dweck mindset, for instance. Are we helping students to become more understanding that mistakes are part of learning, right? And not something to be embarrassed about or ashamed of? And do these environments allow for more open-ended exploration where mistakes can be seen as a step in the way of learning, but you can keep engaging with the materials in ways that are otherwise not possible, so you can get to that deeper learning? So I think these are really important questions, and we're all still trying to answer them.
Got it. So a final question coming from Jennifer, and she has a question about other content creation platforms, and I will throw a couple of my own ideas out there, and if you guys have anything to add, that would be great. So on top of Google Tour Creator, on top of Unity, what are some of the other programs out there? Well, I mean, there is Unreal out there. There are other types of platforms for those sorts of 360 experiences like you would create with a Google Tour Creator, and ones with hotspots in there as well. So there's an organization called ThingLink. They are part of our XR InLearning network, and they allow you to create 360 immersive experiences with hotspots, so you can sort of travel to a series of different experiences. And actually the next webinar we're going to be doing is based on a case study, and that they actually did use the ThingLink technology, and they built out a really interesting series of crime scenes for a criminal justice program. So stay tuned for that. So anyway, Chris and Phil, other thoughts of different content creation platforms for XR. We of course can continue this conversation in the LinkedIn group, and I'm gonna jump back to the slides to show you how to get there.
You know, I have not used, I've heard people talk about one called, I think it's Wonda, W-O-N-D-A. And again, a lot of these are not for education, right, specific. Some are specific for education, a lot are not. So one would have to go through, you know, and understand when are these approaches being intended for marketing or advertising, for instance, versus when are they intended to help students learn. I've heard of something also called ZapWorks. Again, I'm not, I don't mean to imply an endorsement of these because I really haven't used them, and so I don't know much about them, but I know that I've heard of people using these for their own projects.
Great. Chris, anything to add on your side?
Yes, the only one that is coming to my mind that we haven't talked about already, because certainly like ThinLink is something that we're very excited to start incorporating. It used to be called Erasma, and I believe HP bought them out. So I believe it's HP Reveal now that I'm looking at. And that looks to be very powerful for some augmented reality, especially on like mobile phones. So I mean, we have a significant footprint of mobile phones specifically for our VR kits, and so to be able to maybe utilize those for more than just Google Expeditions and YouTube 360 videos, to be able to actually have some AR embedded in that as well. I think we're very excited about that. We just need to do some more research about that.
Absolutely.
And, you know, and I also didn't say, because I'm reading the questions as well, and I think the person mentioned other than Unity and Google Tour, right? So we didn't mention those, but I do know that there are also people teaching computer science with Unity. So if it's in terms, if you want to, for instance, have a more complex development environment, but in a way that your students can be learning key computer science or computational thinking ideas while creating some of these AR or VR spaces. I know there are people doing really innovative work in Unity for that, for instance, but it is different than the question asker asked of teachers on the weekend want to make something for their students to kind of get into, right? And for those you want some of these easier to use environments that are much less powerful, but they also take away a lot of the burden.
Thanks for that, both of you.
And someone else put into the comments, by the way, a couple others, it seems.
Okay, great, thank you. So I do want to launch a final poll and then point you all to our LinkedIn group where we can continue this conversation. So let me jump to our next poll. So I would love to hear what you want to hear about next for the future XR InLearning webinars. We are building out a series, and this is our first. So thank you for participating in the poll and for attending the it's interesting, I'm smiling as I'm watching what everybody's putting in here. I'll give you just a couple more seconds, but it's been great, all these questions, and I really do appreciate you registering for the webinar and attending today. We will be following up with an email pointing you to some resources. I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. So the majority of you would like to hear more qualitative as in terms of case studies as well as quantitative research, so that's great. I'm going to jump to a couple of slides. So we do have a conference that's coming up, co-hosted with Boston University in October, and you can go to xrinlearning.com to find out more about that event. And then finally, we do have a LinkedIn group where we do plan to continue this conversation until it's time for our next webinar. So if you go over to LinkedIn and you search under XR InLearning group, you will find us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation there. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, for all of your questions, and thank you so much, Chris and Phil, for sharing your experiences and your research in XR and learning. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Hester.
All right.
And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes, thanks. Have a great day, everyone.